do not feel safe. The poet remembers. You can kill one, another is born, says the Polish poet Czeslaw Milosz in his famous poem, You Who Wronged. We recall these words again, unfortunately, at the time of a new conflagration, the cruel war waged by Russia against Ukraine. Poetry has been staring in the face of war, violence, since the beginning of time. How does it do it? And what does it reveal in the process about the world, about us, and about itself?
Today we would like to talk about another famous poem by Czeslaw Milosz, Campo dei Fiori. Our guest is well-known American poet and literary critic, Mr. Edward Hirsch. Welcome, Mr. Hirsch, and what are your thoughts on this poem?
I think I should read a couple of stanzas from it just so that people get a sense of how it operates as a poem. It's important to remember that Miłosz wrote this poem in 1943. So he wrote this poem in the midst of tremendous devastation in Poland for World War II. Campo dei Fiori. In Rome on the Campo dei Fiori, baskets of olives and lemons, cobbles spatter with wine and the wreckage of flowers. Vendors cover the trestles with rose pink fish, armfuls of dark grapes heaped on peach down. On this same square, they burned Giordano Bruno. Henchmen kindled the pyre, close pressed by the mob. Before the flames had died, the taverns were full again. Baskets of olives and lemons, again on the vendors' shoulders. I told the Campo dei Fiori in Warsaw by the sky carousel one clear spring evening to the strains of a carnival tune. The bright melody drowned the salvos from the ghetto wall, and the couples were flying high in the cloudless sky. At times, wind from the burning would drift dark kites along, and riders on the carousel caught petals in midair. That same hot wind blew open the skirts of the girls, and the crowds were laughing on that beautiful Warsaw Sunday. Someone will read his moral that the people of Rome or Warsaw haggle, laugh, make love as they pass by martyrs' pyres. Someone else will read of the passing of things human, of the oblivion born before the flames have died. But that day I thought only of the loneliness of the dying, of how, when Giordano climbed onto his burning, he could not find in any human tongue words for mankind who live on. This is an extraordinary poem about suffering. I don't know if you know the Campo dei Fiori, it's still like that today. There's a big market there, it's filled with life, and there's the statue of Bruno and the tremendous martyrdom of Bruno. And Miłosz's remarkable move here is to parallel what happened in the 17th century to the religious heretic and incredible, brilliant poet and philosopher, Giordano Bruno, who dared to question the church's idea about God, with what was happening in Warsaw in 1943. And then at one moment, some people are on a carousel and celebrating on a nice Sunday, and the other people are dying in the Warsaw ghetto on the other side of the wall. And that human suffering is going on while daily life is going on, parallel. And Miłosz parallels, by paralleling what happens in the 17th century to what happens in 1940, he suggests that this is an ongoing problem. This is an ongoing life. That on the one hand, daily life calls us, on the other, people are being murdered at the very same time. And that the loneliness of the dying is a kind of universal truth, a brutal one. And the poem forces us to pay attention during the calm times when we're walking through the world with our own middle class worries. At the same time, over there, on the other side of the wall, people are being murdered. And that it's our human conscience to pay attention to what's happening on the other side of the wall, even as we're engaged in our own daily quotidian lives, which are so meaningful to us. Those other lives are being destroyed at the same time.
Thank you so much for this beautiful interpretation. For me, this poem is also very universal. It's about the Rome, about Giordano Bruno, about the ghetto uprising in Warsaw. But today, in my mind, we are all those spectators sitting on the carousel. The carousel actually changed into the living rooms and screen of our phones. We witnessing people being murdered because of the war in Ukraine. So I think it's very universal poem. It's about pain and suffering, as you said. Thank you for that.
It's also an intervention, because at the end of the poem, Miłosz says, many years have passed, on a new Campo dei Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word. He wants to make you angry. He wants you to remember that while you're going back to your glass of wine, while you're having your meal, while you're seeing your friends, this is happening right now over there, not so far away. And so he wants to incite you to pay attention to this other tremendous grief. Obviously, his grief was 1943 in Warsaw, but by paralleling it to Bruno, he also leaps backward and forward to whenever this happens, which is why I think you're calling it universal.
Yes.
And this is also a poem about the loneliness of heroes and the loneliness of all those who are dying, and about moral discomfort that we feel. We are telling ourselves that we are with them, you know, like we are with the Ukrainians right now. But at the same time, we're not really. We are living our lives, you know, and that is a certain moral dilemma that it's very difficult to resolve. Should we just rush and jump into the fires with them? Some people do that. Some people make this step and go and fight, but most of us don't. How can, you know, what else can we do, you know? And that's the question that many of us are asking ourselves today, probably.
So now we would like to ask you to read one of your own poems that would resonate somehow with Miłosz poem. It's a poem of your choice.
I would like to bring my friend Adam Zagajewski into the conversation and read a poem that I dedicated to him called Krakow 6 a.m. Adam and I taught for 15 years together at the University of Houston. He was one of my closest friends. And he wrote a poem called Houston 6 p.m. And in this poem, Houston 6 p.m., he's thinking about living in Houston and what's happening in Houston at the moment. But he also thinks about what's happening on the other side of the world in Poland and Europe, where his wife is and his friends are, and thinks about what's going on over there. And this parallel structure parallels Miłosz's poem, Two Worlds, but in Zagajewski's poem, it's what's happening at the same time in two different places. And so I wrote a response. I was in Krakow when I wrote it. It was called Krakow 6 a.m. I sit in a corner of the town square and let the ancient city move through me. I sip a cup of coffee, write a little, and watch an old woman sweeping the stairs. Poland is waking up now. Blackbirds patrol the cobblestones, nuns rush by in habits, and the clock tower strikes 6 times. Day breaks into the night's reverie. The morning is as fresh and clean as a butcher's apron hanging in a shop. Now it is pressed in white, but soon it will be spotted with blood. Europe is waking up, but America is going to sleep. A gangly teenager sprawled out on a comfortable bed. He has large hands and feet, and his dreams are innocent and bloodthirsty. I want to throw a blanket over his shoulders and tuck him in again like a child, now that his sleep is no longer untroubled. I'm alone here in the old world, where poetry matters, old hatreds seethe, and history wears a crown of thorns. Fresh bread wafts from the ovens, and daily life follows its own inexorable course, like a drunk weaving slowly across a courtyard, or a Dutch maid throwing open the heavy shutters. I suppose there's always a shop girl stationed in the doorway, a beggar taking up his corner post, and newspapers fluttering from store to store with bad news. Poetry too seeks a place in the world, feasting on darkness but needing light, taking confession, listening for bells, for the first strains of music in a town square. Europe is going to work now. Look at those two businessmen hurrying past the statue of the national bard as her younger brother sleeps on the other side of the ocean, innocent and violent, dreaming of glory.
Very beautiful poem. Thank you so much for reading it. And thank you about talking about your friendship with Adam Zagajewski. Actually, a few days ago, it was first anniversary of his death. So it's like little celebration and to reminded about him. I would like to ask, for me, it's the beautiful morning, the opening of the beautiful morning, the possibilities which morning brings is very quiet, but then is in the contrary very shocking. The butcher apron splattered with bread is like getting me awake from this beautiful morning. First, actually, which got me awake was the blackbird's patrol. I grew up when Poland was in Poland when it was communism. So the patrol for me is like, be careful, be aware. Is something going in here? You cannot. It's not that free. So I like this images, the nuns again, and the clock towers. We just, you know, for me connected to the Krakow now, played by this trumpet every hour and broken in an end. Like the warning about the danger, coming danger. So it's beautiful morning, which calms me down. I love mornings too. But then there's the signs, the darkness appears. So that was for me very, very important.
I feel well read.
Yes,
By your interpretation.
I agree with Malgorzata that it is a very peaceful poem on the surface, maybe. And it may be surprising to contrast it with Miłosz's poem, but at the same time, it is punctuated by those reflections about what was happening in this old world. It's a reflection on history, past history, and maybe future history in a sense, you know. Because
That's right. I mean, Americans, as you know, Americans have a very poor sense of history.
Yes, and it's young, it's innocent, and it's bloodthirsty. Well, Europe is bloodthirsty too, as we see. You know, it's old, it's tired, but it's still the old animosities are seething, ready to explode at a time. And then there is the striking sentence: "Poetry too seeks a place in the world, feasting on darkness, but needing light." That does remind me of Adam Zagajewski, of his understanding of the darkness and our obligation, in a sense, to take the darkness inside, but at the same time, our need for light, our need to praise the mutilated world.
Adam had an idea about poetry related to irony and ecstasy. And his idea about irony was that the poet embraces all the contradictions and brutalities of the world. You might say that what he's calling irony is related to history, and how history draws us into the world. And poetry must pay attention to this, certainly in a place like Poland, where the country was destroyed by two totalitarianisms. At the same time, he discovered something else in himself, something transcendental or eternal, something related to his love of music, his love of beauty, his love of art, and that this is what he called ecstasy, these two contradictory elements. And so at the same, that line is very related to his work, feasting on darkness but needing light, because he's really in quest of something atemporal, I would say, even as he lives in time. It's not as if he's just living as a religious poet and ignoring history. He's paying close attention to history. But in his case, unlike, say, the poets of solidarity who only write about history or only write about politics, Adam writes about that, but he also looks for something else. And that something else is something, a bright diamond of Neoplatonism, a bright diamond of something beyond time, which he sees expressed in fleeting moments of art and music.
Beautiful. We made the connection between Miłosz and Zagajewski, and we are grateful to you for that. Unless you would like to add something and have the last word.
I just want to add something. I felt like that was a conversation between Zagajewski and you, Mr. Hirsch. Like we were present having this conversation in the poems. Thank you for that.
This has been meaningful. This has been meaningful to me. Adam introduced me to Miłosz, and Adam is a disciple of Miłosz in some sense. It's this great legacy of Polish poetry, which has been so meaningful to me. And the conversation in Polish poetry, which I've tried to bring into American poetry, has been meaningful. And it's this relationship that Polish poetry has between poetry and history, poetry and religion. And how unlike, say, many straightly political poets, like most of the poets of Latin America, say, who are importantly, crucially political. In Polish poetry, there's this dialogue between poetry and history, but also poetry and something else, something beyond history. And that you see that in Miłosz, you see that in Herbert, you see that in Szymborska, you see that in Zagajewski, not so much in Różewicz, because he's so pulled to the darker side of life. But this sort of qualified humanism and seeking of some eternal values is tremendously important to these poets as they try to find some tablet of values, as Herbert says, beyond what is passing temporally. So these poets have a lot to teach us in thinking about suffering, human suffering, and how we pay attention to it, and how we seek something deep and abiding, transcendental.
Thank you. That's amazing, very inspirational conversation about Miłosz poems and Polish poetry. So we would like to thank you, Mr. Hirsch, for this very inspiring conversations.
My great pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.